Juneteenth commemorates June 19th, 1865, when enslaved African Americans in Texas finally learned of their freedom more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. It symbolizes the end of slavery and the beginning of a long struggle toward full citizenship and equality. The 16th Street Baptist Church became one of the most important symbols of that continuing struggle. During the Civil Rights Movement, it served as a meeting place and organizing center for activists fighting segregation and racial injustice in Birmingham. On September 15, 1963, the church was bombed by white supremacists, killing 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. The attack shocked the nation and helped build support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In that sense, Juneteenth, which we celebrate this weekend, and the 16th Street Baptist Church are chapters of the same American story. Juneteenth marks the legal end of slavery. The Civil Rights Movement marked the fight to make freedom meaningful. The 16th Street Baptist Church stands as a reminder of the price paid by those who sought to secure the promises of freedom. Both testify to the truth that freedom is not merely declared, it must be ended, expanded, and passed on to future generations. And for many Americans, Juneteenth celebrates liberation, while the 16th Street Baptist Church reminds us of the journey from emancipation to equality required extraordinary courage, faith, and sacrifice. Dr. Martin Luther King often emphasized the arc of history bends towards justice, but only because ordinary people are willing to bend with it. Pastor Arthur Price, you have been pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church here in Birmingham, Alabama, and we're here in Birmingham, Alabama. And talk about, people like to think of Juneteenth celebrated as the end of slavery, but it was the beginning of much more.
Juneteenth was the beginning of African Americans seeking equal rights and freedom from this country. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Lincoln to ensure the freedoms of African Americans. It's supposed to mark the end of slavery. Of course, Juneteenth lets us know that some people didn't hear about that until 1865. 16th Street Baptist Church was born in 1873, 10 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and a group of former slaves wanted a church where they could be affirmed and not blended, so they started the first Baptist church for colored people, and that church was supposed to be a church where they could be affirmed and not blended. Unfortunately, that church was condemned, and they moved to the site where we are now, on the corner of 6th Avenue and 16th Street, around 1884. And then at the turn of the 20th century, the powers that be in Birmingham said that no black church should be that beautiful. The church desired to put a steeple on the church, and the steeple was going to exceed all the white steeples down in downtown Birmingham. And they said no black church should be that beautiful, tear that church down, and they did. So in 1909, Wallace Rayfield, the second licensed African-American architect, designed the 16th Street Baptist Church that is erected today. And 16th Street Baptist Church had a dual purpose. It was a place of spiritual formation and also a place of social recreation. Because in the Jim Crow South, you couldn't go to an Alabama theater, a lyric theater, you couldn't go to a BJCC or any kind of event hall. So when they wanted to have events for black people in Birmingham, they would bring those events to 16th Street Baptist Church. If they wanted to hear W.E.B. Du Bois, they brought him to 16th Street Baptist Church. Booker T. Washington spoke there. Paul Robeson spoke there. Mary McLeod Bethune spoke there. Marian Anderson did a concert there. Jackie Robinson spoke there. Ralph Bunche was there. And the list goes on and on and on. But probably the most noticed speaker that people know about is the late, great Dr. Martin Luther King, who was brought to Birmingham by the bequest of the late, great Dr. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. And the design was to desegregate the parks and the schools in Birmingham. And when Dr. King got to Birmingham in 1963, He was met with very little fanfare. They had some lunch counter sit-ins that didn't garner a whole lot of attention. So they started to plans for some other things. They did a march on Good Friday where King's arrested, placed in jail, pens his letter from the Birmingham jail. But when he's released from the Birmingham jail, he goes to the 16th Street Baptist Church, a place where some of the mass meetings were held. And at the church, his lieutenants, Andrew Young and James Bevel, has filled the church with over 3,000 young people because some of the adults were ambivalent about getting involved in the movement because it was going to cost them their jobs. So the young people said they wanted their freedom, they wanted it now. Dr. King was a little bit ambivalent to getting the kids involved, but once he was convinced, he devised a twofold strategy. One was to have those kids, 3,000, march out of the 16th Street Baptist Church, 50 at a time, to be met by the water hoses, the German Shepherds, and the bully clubs, and to fill up all the jails in Birmingham, which he did. Then they filled up all the jails in Jefferson County, which they did. They filled up all the jails in Bessemer, and then they had to make a makeshift jail at the county fairgrounds. So the first objective was to fill up all the jails, and they did that. The second objective was to get what was going on in Birmingham on this relatively new invention called television. 1963 television was relatively new, and they didn't have Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok. So King wanted to get it on television to show America that there was a divide in the United States, that there were actually two Americas. And once that got the attention of President Kennedy, he sent his brother Bobby down to broker a deal, and then King's emboldened to do the March on Washington. And it was 18 days after the March on Washington, 18 days after King said he had a dream. The response to the I Have a Dream speech in Birmingham was to bomb the 16th Street Baptist Church. Here you have homegrown terrorism on Sunday, September 15th, around 10:22 a.m. is Youth Sunday. The youth are going to be in charge of their worship service, in charge of the praying, the singing, the ushering. It's their day. And the Sunday school lesson that day was a love that forgives. And after learning that Sunday school lesson about a love that forgives, at 10:22 a.m., a bomb goes off, and 22 people are injured in that bombing. 5 girls were in the bathroom getting ready to participate in the worship service. 4 of the 5 girls died. 5th girl was left blinded in one eye. The 4 girls that died were Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robinson. Sarah Collins was blinded in one eye. And there was pandemonium and bedlam in the streets of Birmingham. And they turned their anger into activism, their activism into action, and they would not rest until the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. And then the teeth of that act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, because they wanted to make sure that those 4 little girls' deaths were not in vain. So here, when you talk about from emancipation to equality, 16th Street Baptist Church sits in that story.
You know, it's so fascinating listening to you because, Kevin Harris and Aaron, when we were putting together our 250th anniversary special, and we were traveling all over the world putting together the production pieces, one of my, I think it was Kevin who said to me, I think we should do something on Juneteenth, because I think that's very important as we celebrate our 250th anniversary. So when we came to Alabama to take this show, and Brother Terrence and others gave me a private tour of the 16th Street Baptist Church, I was just, something moved me. I got the spirit. And then I started thinking about Alabama, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, and the Pettus Bridge, and the role that it played, and the sacrifices that so many people made to where we are today.
Yeah, they played a tremendous role. And what happened in Alabama, what happened at 16th Street Baptist Church, is a part of American history. Just as important as the Revolutionary War, just as important as Bunker Hill, just as important as what happened at Gettysburg, just as important as Washington crossing the Delaware, just as important as Paul Revere's famous ride in Boston. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church What happened on the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge helped shape the soul of this nation to make, as Dr. King said, this nation live out the true meaning of the creed that they claim, that all people are created equal. And they kept holding up the Constitution in the face of America to make sure that black people were included in this America.
And how would you give a rating of insights on the condition of the soul of America? Reverend.
If I would give a rating on the condition of the soul of America right now we'll be probably passing, but not failing.
Oh, passing, but not, elaborate, passing.
Well, again, there were so many strides that were made where America could get a B or an A, but with some of the things that's going on today, we're passing but not failing. There's still a whole lot of work to do. There's still a lot of work for against injustice, inequality, and inequity that still needs to be done. 16th Street Baptist Church bombing and the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which has now it's being threatened to be gutted, and the Voting Rights Act, which is being threatened to be gutted, was not the utopia. It gave us hope, and we still have hope because of what happened in the past. So the reason why I say passing but not failing is that we always have that continued hope to make this country better.
Wow. Reverend Arthur Price, pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church here in Birmingham, Alabama, where we are. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. How do you explain to visitors, Pastor, the significance of the church and the broader story of American democracy and civil rights?
Well, I think the significance of the church is this. I view the church as a stage where we share our story about how we overcame some of the inequality, inequities, and injustice. And that stage leads us to a schoolhouse where we teach the lessons that Dr. King taught in 1963 of nonviolence and how we're going to overcome to not be second-class citizens, but to demand for equality. So from the stage to the schoolhouse is a stoop. And the stoop is where you will hear the elders or the ancestors begin to talk about certain things, and you begin to learn certain things. So not only are you getting lessons that are taught, your life is being touched because you're hearing all these stories from the foot soldiers who actually experienced what's going on. And of course, the church is a sanctuary. And in the sanctuary, transformation takes place. And because what happened in Birmingham, Alabama, and at the 16th Street Baptist Church, it transformed this land, and the bitter days of Birmingham became better because the bombing galvanized a generation, it motivated a movement, and it made the dark days of Birmingham much better and brighter because of people who were activated. So when you look at the stage that we have, and the schoolhouse that we have, and the stoop that we have, and the sanctuary we have, it all equals to lessons being taught, lives being touched, and this land being transformed, all because of what happened at 16th Street Baptist Church.
You know, it does seem today that God gets less credit for when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt, when he returned Jerusalem back to the Jews, when he brought blacks in the United States out of slavery, because it was God, not man. God touched the hearts of man. Even what happened to Jews in the Holocaust, when there were countries like ours who did not want to give them safe passage during that time. Do you think that the more we remove ourselves from the Creator is the reason why? I know people like to put things in the world today in a prism of politics and race or all these other things, but what about particularly for you as a reverend, the spiritual illness, and we want to give less credit to God and more credit to ourselves as man, the price that we all paid.
Yeah. So I would agree with you say on the macro level, but on the micro level, we give all credit to the Lord. Our motto at 16th Street is Jesus Christ is the main attraction. One of the reasons why we tell our story, one of the reasons why we share our story is so that God would get the glory. That the only reason why we made it over is because the Lord was on our side. If it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, where would we be? When you look at what happened in Ireland with their Bloody Tuesday, if we would have tried to apply the same strategy that they did, it would have been a massacre. But because the civil rights movement was a spiritual movement and not a political movement, a movement that was started in the church, started by religious leaders, started by people of faith, it took faith to resist and not fight back. It took faith to believe that hearts could be changed, so that legislation could be changed. It took faith, it took prayer. That's why every mass meeting was led with prayer, scripture, and a sermon before the call to action. So when people look at the civil rights movement, they just think of people marching for rights and equality. No, they're missing the whole part of that movement. It was a faith movement that was led by people who were trusting and believing on God the same way Israel believed the Lord would lead them out of Egypt into the promised land.
What is the fight today?
The fight today is, again, to be seen as equal and not as second class. The fight today is, as Dr. King say, to hold these true self-evidence that all men are created equal, and to continue to be the moral conscience to the United States of America, to keep reminding them of what they declared to be true and to live that truth out.
So what do you say to people? Yesterday, Friday was a holiday. People celebrated Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. People celebrate the 4th of July. They support Labor Day. There's Martin Luther King is a holiday that they support. But what about the meaning of why and the significance of those days, especially a day like Juneteenth, and what was really sacrificed?
Well, a day like Juneteenth marks, again, the end of slavery, the end of free labor of black people in this country, the end of quote unquote abuse of African Americans in this country. But we also know that just because it was legislated on paper, it was not legislated in the heart. Because you go from slavery, then you go to Reconstruction, then you go from Reconstruction, then you go to Jim Crow, then you go to Jim Crow, then you go to segregation. So the fight kept on continuing, and the fight still continues to this day.
But you know, the story of 16th Street Baptist Church is not only about injustice, it's also about forgiveness and redemption. What has faith taught your congregation about healing?
That you cannot allow people to hold you hostage. That forgiveness does not mean that the scar is not there. I broke my leg a long time ago, and I have a scar from where the cast was on my leg. The scar reminds me that a long time ago I broke my leg. The scar is still there, but forgiveness says that I will no longer allow you to hold me hostage by hating you for what you did to me. That you no longer control the narrative, that I'm going to remember the narrative a little bit differently. I'm not going to continue to repeat the narrative. I'm going to reclaim it, and I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to make it something better.
Well, what does Christian reconciliation look like in practice?
Well, reconciliation looks like, number one, someone has to admit that wrong was done. Mm-hmm. Once there's an admission that there was injustice done, then we can move to reconciliation. But if there's no admitting that wrong was done, then you cannot move to reconciliation. So we have to admit that slavery was wrong, and impoverishing people based on their color was wrong. Once we admit that and confess that, we can move to reconciliation.
So finally, what responsibility do we have to preserve places like the 16th Street Baptist Church for future generations?
Well, 60th Street Baptist Church has become a National Historic Landmark in 2006. In 1965, let me just back up a bit, when the bomb went off, it was literally a bomb that was heard all around the world. The people of Wales donated a window, a black Jesus with one hand pushing out hatred, the other hand open for forgiveness, to remind us that reconciliation is possible. So today we serve as a testament that love, that tragedy can turn into triumph, and that love can conquer hate. And that what happened at 16th Street Baptist Church is not something that happened hundreds of years ago. It only happened like 63 years ago. And because of that, it made us take a look at ourselves introspectively, and people had to reconcile. They may have been against races integrating together, but people were not for murder and terrorism, which that was. So it reminds us today that we still have a lot of work to do, that things can get better and things will be better, but we have to work at it.
What did the murders in Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, when it did happen, and Clemente Pinckney was my cousin, what did that stir in you, considering what happened in 1963?
Yeah, it was a symbiotic relationship that we had with them. In fact, in 2019, they came to worship with us so we can share that symbiotic relationship and show solidarity about two tragedies that happened. Again, it was another tragedy that should not have happened, and it reminds us that we should never forget what happened in 1963, and we shouldn't forget what happened at Charleston, South Carolina, because hate, even though we may have legislated some laws or legislated some rules in our land, we still gotta work on people's heart, because you can't legislate the heart. So that lets us know that's the work that needs to be done.
One of the things you said as I say goodbye to you at the beginning of the broadcast, you acknowledge in your own way that much progress has been made. Mm-hmm. Reverend Arthur Price, talk about why it's important to recognize that progress when we look where
we came
brought
from.
Us from.
Yeah, so when we look from slavery to Reconstruction, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow, from segregation to bus boycotts and church bombings, and to look at having the first African-American president of the United States and having black mayors and black legislators and governors and people in political office, it lets us know that a lot has been accomplished and that we should not rest on our laurels, and we should not believe that we're going back to a time where we were considered to be less than. I have not seen, ear have not heard of the great things that God has in store for his people.
You know, I can't thank you enough for opening your doors of 16th Street Baptist Church to us during this visit. It was my first time there, and it did something for my soul.
Okay.
And I appreciate your spirit, your humility, your love of the Lord, your love of people, you know, and continuing this great legacy of 16th Street Baptist Church. And then maybe one of these days I'll get an invitation and we'll come and worship with you.
Invitation's always open.
But I want to come when you're pastor. I want to hear you preach.
I'm preaching Sunday. I'm preaching tomorrow. Invitation's right there.
I love
See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
God bless you.
We'll be back. Don't go away. This is the Armstrong Williams Show. You know, Robert, I'm so thankful that you and your wife drove from Atlanta to Birmingham, Alabama to join us live. And broadcast studio. You know, I went back and I was looking at some of your quotes, okay? And, you know, you talked about how previous generations fought for the right to vote, equal protection under the law, and access to education. You've argued, however, that the next frontier of civil rights is ownership. What do you mean by that?
Well, by that I mean, let's look at what's happened the last 2 years, for example. Much of the Civil Rights Movement, most of the Voting Rights Act was based on executive orders. It was based on Supreme Court decisions. It was based on agency administrations, the EEOC, the DOJ, et cetera. And all it took was one executive order in order to overturn much of that. We did not have durable civil rights legislation. We didn't have durable voting rights legislation. So that means that this generation's fight is not going to be the same fight that Dr. King was doing. It was not the same fight that W.B. Du Bois was doing. It's not the same fight that Frederick Douglass was doing. Now it's a question of ownership and durability of these rights. So the question is, how is the next generation of African Americans going to economically be able to compete globally? Not just about integrating lunch counters, but how can we go head to head with kids who are fighting right now in Nigeria, in China, in Taiwan, across the globe? The next barrier in the next fight in civil rights is going to be, how exactly do we move from a asking position, asking if we can have these rights, praying, marching, protesting, to being in a position where we can demand equality at that table. So I think this next battle going forward is going to be from a position of not coming up from slavery, as it was 150 years ago, but going upwards towards prosperity and an enduring freedom that can exist within our people.
Well, why do you believe then ownership and not simply employment is the key to building lasting wealth and opportunity?
Employment means somebody can fire you. If you are asking for a grant, that means somebody can cut that off. When you own, that means you control the means of production. That means you are at an equal bargaining table. I'll give you an example. When the U.S. president goes to China, he goes there as an equal. That is a peer-to-peer conversation. I need your markets. I need your rare earth elements. I need the ability to trade with you. And you have a very different conversation than when they're going to a developing nation, for example, and the developing nation is asking for aid, asking for protection. So I think as African Americans who have been here on the U.S. continent from the beginning, prior to 1619, there were Africans who came over with Spanish explorers, some of the founders of this nation. We should no longer be in a position of simply saying, can I have? We should be in a position of saying, this is what we have, and we can dictate terms, and we can negotiate as equals. I think that's the next area that we have to move into. We have the population, we have the knowledge, we have the intellectual capacity, we have the economic ability. Now we simply need the organization to push that going forward.
So is it possible for communities to achieve true economic empowerment without owning businesses, real estate, and productive assets?
It's not. And we can look at every immigrant experience that we've seen into America to see that it is not. You cannot have prosperity long term without ownership. If you look at groups who have come to America, the groups who have come here, established roots, and then started building businesses, building communities, building out an ecosystem that exists within themselves. If you look back 100 years later, those are ones who have prospered. The ones who have come and said, well, we're going to hope that the government gives us education, gives us housing, gives us grants, gives us jobs, etc. They have faded into the background because all it takes is a change in administration or a change in national climate, and you don't own nothing no more.
So you believe that ownership creates independence and dignity?
I've been rereading Frantz Fanon lately, particularly The Wretched of the Earth. And he talks about the cleansing nature of revolution, the fact that when people stand up on their own and say that I'm looking at you man to man, eye to eye, and that we are equals, and now we will negotiate as equals because I have the weight of what we have achieved behind us. That's the cleansing nature of what a revolution is. However, you have groups who are simply saying, please, will you give me? Will you help me? Will you bring me up? Those always fall to the wayside because it's one thing to appeal to the humanity of a group. It's another thing to say that you need this from me. This is what I provide to you. Now let's go into a negotiation, and you can look at the Iran deal that we just saw this week. In any other situation, America goes in and says, we're going to bomb you, you're going to do what we say. We saw that in Venezuela. You go to Iran, we say we're going to bomb you. They say, well, we're going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to strike the Bab el-Mandab Strait. We might strike the Suez Canal. We'll strike Diego Garcia. We'll strike your bases in Crete. And how about this? We'll shut down all of your bases in the Middle East, and now we can negotiate. And what happens when you're negotiating eye to eye in those situations? America says, well, you'll have $300 billion in order to rebuild your nation if we bombed you, and we apologize for everything you did, and you go ahead and control all this stuff. We'll take our boats back. So this is why I say you have to come to people as equals when you're negotiating. Otherwise, you're always on a knee. When at this point in time, what African Americans contributed to this nation, we should be standing eye to eye.
Historically, Robert, civil rights leaders fought to open doors. Do you, in your experience, and you're making sense here, by the way, let me just be clear, I'm enjoying this conversation, but do you see entrepreneurship as the next step after access and opportunity?
That is what all of our civil rights leaders have actually believed in. That if you go back to Frederick Douglass, for example, they believed that it was an iterative process. It is handing a baton off from one generation to another. It is one generation building the foundation and the next generation building off of that. So the first thing to do was to get off the plantation. We had to get off this plantation first, and we got off of it. Then we said we have to build our own businesses and create our own industry. That was the conversation we had between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, and we did that. Then we had to build our intellectual and economic infrastructure, and we did that under MLK and under Malcolm. Then we said we have to move into industry and voting. We did that under Jesse and Sharpton. So the next area is saying that we are going to move from that into the ownership class. It's not enough to just play for the Atlanta Falcons. We're not going to own some NFL teams. It's not enough to simply say we're going to bounce a ball up and down the court. We're going to, Ice Cube said, I'm going to own the Big Three league. And now we're going to negotiate with me as an owner. So I think the next phase in the civil rights movement is not simply a change or a rebuilding. It is this concept of saying this is the final form. This is what all the previous generations have been fighting for. They didn't want us to still be marching and singing songs in 2026. I'm pretty sure if you talk to anybody who was at Selma or who was at Montgomery, they would say, well, do you still want to be marching and protesting in 2026? Absolutely not. They would say, we need to be owning and fighting and building and creating.
Or how do you move from a mindset of consumption to one of creation and ownership?
It requires leadership. I use the example of European nationalization in the 1860s and 1870s. When people think about Germany as a concept, they think it goes back 1,000 years. Germany was unified in the 1860s while we were fighting our Civil War. If you think about the concept of Italy, people think that goes back to the Roman Empire. Italy was nationalized in the 1870s. You know, pizza didn't come to America until the 1930s and 1940s after the war, for example. So when we're talking about changing this mindset, it's about African Americans seeing themselves not simply as part of this. They always told us about the American melting pot. We have to see ourselves less as a melting pot, but more so as a gumbo. We're all held together, but the okra is here, the sausage is here, the chicken is here. We're all together as a nation, but we're all going to hold together our structural integrity and add together to this soup. So African Americans have to start seeing themselves in a unified manner. People who have assets are spending money with people in our own community. People who own houses are selling them to other people who need to buy houses. People who own businesses are employing people who need work. And you're building your economic base. So when you're having these conversations on redistricting, for example, you're not saying, please don't take away my congressional district. I really hope you don't do it. You'll say, well, these are the economic numbers, and here's the demographic data that tells you cannot do so. And therefore, we will maintain our seats because we're coming in a position of power, as opposed to hoping that the better angels will convince you to do so. In international relations, they call the rational actor model of international relations. Every party is going to do what's in the best of their intellectual and economic self-interest. We have to do the same rational actor model here in the U.S. Otherwise, we'll see ourselves in 150 years still in a position of marching and protesting and hoping that we can appeal to the best angels, as opposed to building and structuring and creating the next generation going forward.
You know, finally, before we say goodbye to you, how important is it for young people to understand investing, business formation, and financial literacy at an early age?
That's the only thing that matters. We have geniuses in our community. We have people who are the most hardworking folks in our community. And if you don't understand money, it won't mean anything. I found that out in my 30s and 40s. That if you don't understand how money works, if you don't understand that it works, if you don't understand that it is a living and breathing entity, you will always fall behind. You can work your finger to the bone while you have a friend who understands money who will take the same $10,000 and invest it and have $1 million in 3 years while you were just paying your rent and now you're still working in the same place. So I tell folks all the time, my wife is an educator, she teaches people all the time, but you at home need to be teaching your children, teaching your families how money works. Because as long as you are a worker, you will always be hoping for a job. Once you are an entrepreneur, a creator, an economic innovator, well, now you are contributing back to the market.
Robert, it's always terrific, man, to hear your wisdom, your intellect, and your common sense. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Armstrong.
So much for joining us. And we will be back. You know, Dr. Vaughan, years after the pandemic began, millions of Americans say they are still experiencing symptoms that they attribute to long-term COVID. Explain exactly what is long-term COVID and why it's been so difficult for the public to understand and how that plays in what you do in your medical practice.
So long COVID is really just kind of the after effects of how the virus affected the body. And especially in COVID, it uniquely impacted the vasculature. All of us have vessels everywhere, vessels to our kidneys, vessels to our brain, vessels to the heart. And when you have a virus that actually attaches to the receptor on the inside of vessels, you're likely to have damage in those things, and it can cause symptoms all over the place. A lot of the most classic symptoms are brain fog, fatigue, lots of kind of interesting kind of neuropathies or those kind of things. And that makes it even harder to diagnose because a lot of them sound or look like other disease processes. But the important thing is how it relates to your infection. Does that make sense? So something that all of a sudden appeared after you had COVID, a lot of times in my world makes it much likely that COVID might be the cause, and the treatment is a little bit different than would have been typically treated that way.
You know, I've been in preparation for this time with you today in Birmingham. You know, some patients report debilitating fatigue, brain fog, memory issues, shortness of breath, heart-related symptoms long after recovering from the initial infection. What are the most common symptoms you are seeing in your practice?
So to me, it's the big difference or change that somebody sees. A lot of these folks had no issue prior, and then, you know, related to their infection, all of a sudden have a lot of these issues appear. Fatigue, chest pain, cardiac issues that they really didn't have before. A lot of my patients initially were very athletic people that literally were basically, you know, running 4-minute miles and had, you know, incredible endurance. And all of a sudden, there's this pretty stark change in terms of their overall symptoms, where they're fatigable, they're exertionally short of breath. But the interesting thing is, as you kind of back that out, it's easy in the young people to say something has changed. But in people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's a lot easier to rationalize that it's just aging or some kind of other thing. And what I've found in my practice is in a lot of those age groups, especially if their symptoms relate or actually follow after they had COVID, it can very much be related to the COVID infection itself. And the treatment for that is different. And a lot of times the actual outcomes are much better than you would think by just saying, oh, you're 60, get over it.
Well, why is it that some people appear to recover completely while others to continue to struggle months or years later?
Yeah, I think it has to do with a lot of kind of predispositions. And what I would say is it's almost like what you brought to the party. Does that make sense? And so some of those things are related to how your immune system worked, how your vasculature was to begin with. Did you have diabetes and hypertension pre-existing that already made your vessels vulnerable to the infection? So a lot of those kind of things are what we see. In the younger population that were otherwise healthy before, a lot of times we see that they're had a hypermobility or had an immune system that was more overactive, causing damage, and then that thing is kind of the insult that propagates the problem.
Talk about what you've learned from your patients and your practice during and after COVID.
So what I've learned most importantly is that the physicians need to get back to being clinicians that care about their patients and are curious why they're visiting the office. A lot of times, doctors, we've been kind of marginalized to think just through protocols and think through things that, hey, if it doesn't meet these kind of criteria, it can't be this and there's nothing wrong. The biggest thing that I've always learned is it's okay as a physician to say, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. And we need more doctors that actually have that impetus to actually back in clinical medicine, listening to patients, caring about them as individuals, and then actually coming up with solutions that may not be in the textbook, because the reality is the textbook for what we're going through right now is going to be written 10 to 15 years from now. And the problem is people are suffering today.
Is long-term COVID primarily a respiratory condition, or are we discovering that it affects multiple systems throughout your body?
So it is really not a respiratory disease. Even how it affected the lungs was mainly in the vessels of the lungs. And the reality is when a lot of people would start to see their oxygen decrease. The reason the oxygen decreased at the same time that they felt like they could breathe okay was because the vessels in the lungs were impacted, not because it was full of fluid or like a pneumonia, but instead the vessels where oxygen interfaces with your blood was impacted, and that limited oxygen getting to the body. But the same thing is happening even in the muscle tissues, the brain, the heart, and all the other organs. And in that case, we're starting to see a lot of these cardiovascular changes. Almost, some people would call it like we're aging quicker because of it, because of the damage that's being done to the vessels. Because again, COVID was primarily a vascular disease. It affected the vessels primarily, and the problem is the vessels are everywhere.
Where did Dr. Fauci and his fail us?
So I think the first thing was not being honest about the origins of the virus, the fact that it was transmissible and we knew it earlier than he would claim, even if looking back. Again, one of my friends, Dr. Redfield, who's a good man, would tell you that a lot of the things that he knew as he talked to the Chinese CDC representative was the wet market wasn't an issue. It was something that was been present in the community for a lot longer than we knew, and the outcomes were affecting a lot of people, so it was transmissible. The other thing that he did was the solution to helping people was to not help people and wait on him. And the reality is, as a community, first of all, as a doctor, what I want to do is take care of disease. I shouldn't be scared of disease. And in fact, that's what I committed to doing when I went to medical school, was I was going to take care of people when they're sick, not wait until they're well and then take care of them. And so he scared the physician community, he scared the patients, but in reality, a lot of things that we could have done to help people were already there and were being used by other countries. And instead, what he said was, wait on this basically panacea vaccine as the solution. And then lying about the fact that when you got the vaccine, it would prevent infection, that you were no longer going to be able to transmit it to other people. They knew that even from the studies that wasn't true. And so now medicine has to suffer with being less reliable in the general community than lawyers, which is terrible. Meaning even the most recent JAMA article looking at the trust in medical profession, it went from 70% to under 40% in 4 years. Now to me, that is a devastating decline in a profession that for history in America has been respected and really been equivalent to what I would think of great physicians as pastors. We cared about our communities, and that's what we need to get back to.
Are there certain populations, is it true, more at risk for long COVID, or can it virtually affect anyone?
So I do think in the younger population, it's affecting kids that have a history of what I would call allergy-type symptoms, but also that are flexible and hypermobile. A fancy word for that is basically their ability to, a lot of my patients can be ballerinas or really great athletes that all of a sudden have issues. And again, we think it has to do with how the immune system in these folks is different, and they're not able to clear it as easily, and the consequences of the ongoing inflammatory process continues way beyond the real viral symptoms. In a lot of ways, a lot of people think of COVID just as the 5 to 7 days that they have a sore throat or a fever and those things. But this is a virus that actually persists in terms of its inflammatory consequences to all parts of the body.
Looking back, Dr. Vaughan, what have we learned about the intersection of, let's say, public health, science, communication, and patient trust?
So I think public health messaging needs to be honest. It also needs to realize that it is separate from what is a physician's relationship with a patient. Most people that I see as a patient don't want 100,000 other people in there listening. But in many ways, that's how public health looks through things. They look at things through spreadsheets and trends and data. But what doctors should be doing is actually caring for the patient in front of them and trying to figure out how to make them better. And the reality is when public health is forced upon the medical practice, then the outcome is devastating, just like it was in the last 5 years.
Are you concerned about the next virus?
I am in some ways. I will tell you, I'm more concerned that the virus that will come, just like a lot of other viruses that are named, like the Marburg virus or those kind of things, or even a couple strands of swine flu. They came from labs where the safety standards were not adequate.
Compromised.
We're compromised, and when it gets out in the community, and we're playing God in many ways when we shouldn't. A lot of them think that getting ahead of the virus and knowing about it before it happens and then being able to intervene after it is the right solution. But I would argue that hasn't worked. And if the last 5 years proved anything, the consequences to that type of research can be devastating for the world.
How does NIH believe that scientists coming from a region with Ebola can try to wiggle their way through customs with monkeypox and not expect to get caught, and the dangers and the lives that are threatened by these actions?
Yeah, it's, to me, again, a lot of this, when we think about even the words quarantine, that was historically a ship from out in the sea having to land on an island for 40 days before they could come into the community that they worked. And the reason is because there was a lot of unknowns. And the last thing you want to do when you have unknowns is push that into a society and then find out afterwards. And so a lot of the mechanisms for public health need to eliminate the sources, biolabs, the things that we're investing, and thankfully a lot of that has been changing, especially by Ron Paul and Ron Johnson in the Senate, but also be more proactive in not just assuming that everything's fine, but being active in that community to really eliminate the ability for those people to come back into society. Actually, I think in some ways the hantavirus was a good example. That actually was something that they did pretty well.
You think we should still be quarantined?
That depends. I think the hantavirus is a unique virus in terms of its incubation period.
That's what the HHS secretary said.
Yeah.
Leave them quarantined.
Yeah, and so, but I think it was very different than when we have something that pops up in China that we funded and really had,
That's fair. That's a fair point. What gives give hope to everyday Americans who've lost trust in science, doctors, and these medical institutions? They feel they've been betrayed.
Yeah, I think what the patients need to demand is the return of clinical medicine and doctors caring about patients and taking care of them as individuals. To remove from the statistics and the Excel spreadsheets and you didn't go on this check mark. We need, in many ways, I'd actually say that we need the entrepreneurial problem solvers back in medicine. We need the Mayo brothers. We need people that started the Cleveland Clinic. The way medicine is driven now, where it's doled out by the government and really directed at the academic medical centers, innovation is not going to happen. They will get better at doing things better and safer. But actually, a lot of times the innovations in medicine and the hope in medicine comes from outside the academy. And I think we need to inculcate that and actually get entrepreneurial problem-solving physicians back and honored, not waiting for academic money from the NIH. We need to incentivize them to think outside the box and think of solutions that no one else has thought of, not just big pharma.
No, I can't thank Reverend Arthur Price, Robert Hilliard, and Jordan Vaughn for joining us for this special edition of the Armstrong Williams Show from Birmingham, Alabama. I thank the incredible crew here at our ABC station here in Birmingham and everybody else who's been involved in the production, Greg Marsoni. I'm Armstrong Williams. Thank you for joining us and enjoy your weekend.